Story title: The Fractured Light. Chapter 1: The Unseen Presence. The first time Elliot saw the figure, it was in his dreams. A flash of light, like fire licking the sky, blazed across his mind's eye. But when the light faded, there was no warmth, no comfort. Instead, a dark silhouette stood before him. A woman with wings, burnt and twisted, her face obscured by shadows. The wings, once bright and pure, had been charred into blackened, skeletal remnants. The fire that had consumed her wasn't just flames, it was a kind of suffering, seeping through every fiber of her being. It wasn't a pleasant dream. In fact, it felt less like a dream and more like an intrusion. Each time Elliot woke, the image lingered at the edges of his thoughts like smoke, twisting in his chest until he could hardly breathe. But it was just a dream, right? That's what he told himself. The mind does strange things when sleep-deprived, when overwhelmed with the weight of deadlines, work and expectations. As an artist, Elliot was no stranger to the surreal nature of his dreams. The world of his mind could sometimes be as vivid and real as the world around him. But it didn't mean they were more than figments of his imagination. Or so he thought, until the first strange occurrence. It happened on a quiet Wednesday evening, as Elliot was working in his small apartment in downtown Greystone. The city outside was drenched in fog, the dim glow of streetlights filtering through the mist like the eyes of ghosts watching from the darkness. His easel stood in the center of the room, an unfinished painting still waiting for his touch. The image on the canvas was vague, abstract swirls and streaks of red and black, the colors reminding him of fire, though it wasn't intentional. He had spent hours staring at it, his brush hovering above the surface, uncertain. His art had always been his escape, his way of connecting with something beyond the mundane. But lately, inspiration had eluded him. The dream had left him feeling hollow, and no matter how he tried to pour his frustration into the brush, it felt like the colors bled out of him and onto the canvas in a way that made him feel unmoored from himself. His phone vibrated suddenly, breaking his reverie. A text from his mother. Nothing unusual. Just a simple, "How are you, Elliot?" But as he read the message, something caught his attention. There was a small crackling sound in the background, almost as though someone were whispering faintly, just at the edge of his hearing. His eyes darted around the room. He was alone, he knew that. But the feeling of being watched, a sensation that had crept up on him ever since the dreams began, was now palpable. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, a chill curling its fingers up his spine. He glanced over to the mirror on the opposite wall. A quick scan of the room showed nothing. The soft light of his desk lamp illuminated the space, casting a warm, familiar glow across his belongings. Yet something felt off. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, more oppressive, as though they were trying to encroach upon the space he occupied. The phone vibrated again. He snapped his gaze back to the screen. Another text. "Call me." It was from his mother again, but the words seemed different somehow, as if she wasn't really there, speaking through the phone. Elliot rubbed his temples and pressed the green button to answer. "Mum?" he said, his voice trembling slightly, but there was no response. "Mum?" he repeated, louder this time, feeling the edge of panic creep in. The phone crackled, and then he heard it, a voice. It wasn't his mother's voice. The voice that answered him was low and distorted, as if it were coming from far away, twisted by static. "It's not her, Elliot. It's not her. You have to listen to me." The words made no sense. He looked at the phone in his hand, but the screen was blank. It was as if the call had been disconnected, yet the faint whispering continued. "She's gone. She's been taken. And soon. So will you." His heart raced. The room suddenly felt suffocating. The shadows seemed to close in around him, creeping into the corners of his vision. Elliot dropped the phone, his breath catching in his throat as he stumbled back, his eyes darting wildly across the room. There was a movement in the mirror, a fleeting reflection. He turned his head sharply to the side, but when he looked, there was nothing there. Just the normal reflection of his room, just the normal world, the one he had always known, the one that felt increasingly alien, even though it remained unchanged. The room felt colder, though he hadn't touched the thermostat. A breeze, unnatural and bone-chilling, seemed to flow from nowhere. wrapping itself around his legs, his arms. And then he saw it. In the mirror, for a fleeting moment, something moved. A figure standing just beyond his shoulder, her wings stretched behind her. They were burnt, scorched remnants of what once was, blackened and frail, like the withered remnants of a forgotten memory. Her eyes, if they could be called eyes, were wide and vacant, hollowed out as if the life inside her had been consumed by the flames. The fire had ravaged her, and yet she stood, untouched by time. Elliot froze, his heart thudding in his chest. The whispering voice echoed through the room, louder now, closer. "You've seen me, and now you can't unsee." The mirror shook, rattling against the wall. He took a step back, his legs weak, his breath shallow. The room began to distort, the walls warping and stretching as if the reality around him was being pulled into some other plane of existence. The angel in the mirror smiled. It was a twisted grin, an expression that didn't belong on a face. Something sickly, something wrong. She was not beautiful, nor serene. She was a broken thing, a creature forged in agony, its sole existence to haunt and destroy. Elliot stumbled backward, knocking over his easel. The crash of the canvas hitting the floor echoed in his mind, louder than any other sound. He ran for the door, his hand fumbling for the handle, but when he yanked it open, he froze. Outside the door, standing in the hallway, was the same figure, the burned angel, her wings now more fragmented than ever, but still unmistakable. "Who are you?" Elliot whispered, his voice trembling. The angel didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her presence alone spoke volumes, a presence that stretched beyond physical form, beyond logic, into something ancient and eternal, something that had waited for him, waited for the moment when he would finally see her. "You are not alone, Elliot." Her voice echoed in his mind as she stepped forward, the darkness around her growing heavier, more suffocating. The smell of smoke filled the air, thick and acrid. Elliot closed his eyes, his heart hammering in his chest. He had never believed in the supernatural, never believed in angels or demons, but now he was trapped in a nightmare that he could not escape. And the nightmare was just beginning. Chapter 1. The Unseen Presence, continued. Elliot stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes locked on the twisted figure standing before him. The burned angel. He could feel the weight of her gaze, even though her face remained hidden in the shadows. The air around him seemed to bend, thickening with an unnatural chill, as if the space itself was suffocating. The angel's wings, the skeletal remains of what had once been something divine, twitched slightly. They seemed to move with a life of their own, as if they were aware of him, studying him, even though they were little more than scorched fragments of blackened bone and torn, charred feathers. Elliot's heart hammered in his chest, every beat reverberating in his skull like a drum. His legs felt like lead, as if they had become part of the ground beneath him, anchoring him in place. His mouth was dry, and he could barely breathe. The figure before him did not move, but he could sense the overwhelming power that emanated from her, like a storm on the edge of a cliff waiting to break. Her presence was impossible. She was not supposed to be here. She could not be real, but the longer he stared at her, the more he realized that she was no figment of his imagination, no dream. No, she was something else entirely, something ancient, something not meant to be seen. He blinked, trying to tear his gaze away, but the angel's form seemed to follow him with her invisible eyes. His breath caught in his throat, his body unable to move. A distant ringing filled his ears. His mind, fragile and panicked, tried to block it out, but it only grew louder, growing into a screeching sound that felt like it was drilling into his skull. He clutched his head in his hands, his nails digging into his scalp as though trying to tear the noise from inside his mind. The ringing swirled into something else. A voice, barely a whisper, but unmistakably there. "You can't run from me." It was the same voice from the phone, the distorted, ghostly whisper. And now it was here, right next to him, in the cold silence of his apartment. "You've seen me. You've awakened what was never meant to be awakened." Elliot could feel the air around him grow heavy, saturated with an ancient, malevolent energy. It pressed against him, squeezing the breath from his lungs, and his vision swam as his head spun. "Why are you here?" His voice came out in a rasp, weak and unsteady, but it was the only thing he could focus on. The words fell from his lips like a desperate plea for sanity. "Who are you?" For a moment, there was only silence. The angel did not answer him, but Elliot felt the air pulse with the faintest of movements. The space around him shifted ever so slightly. He could sense her, just beyond the veil of his comprehension, the sensation like a cold breath against the back of his neck. The wings flared, and in that instant, Elliot's stomach twisted into knots. The figure did not speak, but it didn't have to. There was a message in her presence, an unspoken warning, a truth that clung to the very air around him like smoke. His body trembled as he took a small step back, the world spinning around him, everything slipping out of focus. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the figure vanished. No movement, no sound. It was as though she had never been there at all. Elliot stood in the doorway, the space before him now empty. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he tried to steady himself. His mind struggled to process what had just happened. He blinked rapidly, as if he could wipe away the image of the burned angel, but it lingered there in the back of his mind, a terrifying memory that refused to fade. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the walls, the corners. But everything was as it should be, his apartment, his safe haven. But now it felt like a trap. The walls felt close. The light overhead flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows across the room, their shapes moving with a life of their own. What was happening? Was it a hallucination? A nightmare? Elliot's mind grasped at these thoughts like a drowning man clinging to a fragile lifeline. But deep down, he knew. He knew this was real. The phone call, the whispering voice, the image of the angel. This was no trick of the mind. His thoughts spiraled as he retreated into the living room, pacing back and forth, desperately trying to make sense of it all. He ran his hands through his hair, gripping the strands tightly, as if trying to hold himself together. The chill in the air seemed to seep deeper into his bones, and he shivered involuntarily. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the angel, the burned creature that had appeared to him, wasn't simply haunting him. She was watching him. She had always been there, lurking in the corners of his life, waiting for the right moment to make herself known. But why him? Why now? A sound broke through his thoughts, sharp and sudden, the quietest of knocks on the door. A tap, tap, tap. It was faint, but it was there. And it was not the sound of the wind or the settling of the building. It was deliberate. Someone or something was knocking. His body tensed. He slowly turned towards the door, his feet frozen to the floor, every instinct screaming at him to run, to escape, to get as far away from this as possible. But his legs betrayed him, unwilling to move. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed again, sending a cold shiver up his spine. Elliot swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt as if he had been plunged into the very heart of darkness, a place where he no longer had control, where every moment stretched into infinity. Slowly, with trembling hands, he reached for the door handle. His fingers brushed against the cold metal, and for a second, the world seemed to stop. The silence around him grew oppressive, thick and suffocating. The knock had stopped, but the air was still alive with something that was not right. With a deep breath, he turned the handle, and then the door creaked open, inch by inch. Chapter 2. Echoes in the dark. Elliot stood frozen at the threshold of his apartment, the door creaking open in his hand like an omen, a sound far too loud in the unnatural silence that had enveloped him. For a moment, his surroundings seemed to blur, the edges of his vision distorting as the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to shut the door and lock himself inside, away from whatever waited for him just beyond the threshold. But his feet, heavy and unwilling, remained rooted to the floor. The faint tapping, the knock that had shaken him from his stupor, was now gone, replaced by the dreadful quiet that stretched out like an endless chasm. He breathed in, the air sharp and biting, and reached for the door, pushing it open just a little more. The hallway beyond was empty, a dark expanse of dim lights flickering overhead, casting long, wavering shadows against the walls. For a moment, Elliot felt his heart slow. Perhaps it had all been a trick, his mind playing cruel games on him, disoriented by the terror that had taken root in his chest. But no, he knew it wasn't a trick. That voice, the whisper that had crawled into his head, cold and hollow, like something that had never truly been alive, still echoed faintly in the back of his mind. You've awakened what was never meant to be awakened. The words clung to him like tar, and the sensation of being watched, the weight of unseen eyes, pressed in from all sides. His body began to tremble, not from the cold, but from an inexplicable fear that seemed to come from deep within, from a place he couldn't quite comprehend. Without thinking, he stepped into the hallway, his gaze sweeping across the empty stretch of it. There was something here. He could feel it in the air, thick and sour, like the stillness before a storm. His thoughts were a whirlpool, everything spiraling down, down, down into a void of uncertainty. Was he truly alone? Had the angel, the burned, mutilated figure, been real? Or was it just his mind, unraveling under the weight of the unknown? A sudden noise broke through his frantic thoughts. Something soft, something faint, but undeniable, a rustling, as though something or someone was moving just out of sight. He stiffened, his pulse quickening. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the shadows growing longer, more menacing. "Hello?" Elliot's voice cracked, sounding too small in the vastness of the hall. It echoed in the space, bouncing off the walls, but there was no answer. His stomach churned, the emptiness in the hallway swallowing up his words. He stepped forward, cautiously now, each footfall seeming impossibly loud, like a drumbeat echoing in the silence. The hallway stretched out endlessly before him, the faint flickering lights casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to crawl along the floor and up the walls. They moved like living things, writhing and squirming in the corner of his vision, never quite still. He reached the corner of the hall and paused. There was something at the end of the passage. A door, perhaps. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shadows gathering there. It was impossible to see clearly. The further he moved, the more everything seemed to blur, the boundaries of the hallway growing indistinct, stretching like a shadowy dream. And then, suddenly, the lights flickered out. For a split second, the world was plunged into darkness, the oppressive quiet broken only by the pounding of his heart in his chest. The smell of dampness, of mildew and decay, filled the air. He gasped, his breathing becoming shallow, erratic. His pulse raced in his throat, a frantic, suffocating rhythm that drowned out all other sound. When the lights returned, they flickered once, twice, then steadied, revealing something that made his blood run cold. The figure was there. At first, Elliot thought he had imagined it, some trick of the light, some fragment of his panicked mind. But no. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood the burned angel. Her form was hazy, like something out of a fevered dream, but there was no mistaking her. The wings, charred and twisted, stretched unnaturally from her back, their scorched tips scraping against the floor. Her body was a mass of raw, burned flesh, her skin peeling and cracked. But her eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, locked onto him with an intensity that stole the breath from his lungs. She did not move. She did not speak. But in the stillness of the hallway, her presence was a suffocating weight, a thing that pressed down on him, twisting his thoughts, and clouding his mind with a terror he could not escape. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. The silence was too thick, too absolute. His hands shook uncontrollably at his sides, and his knees trembled as though they might give way beneath him at any moment. The figure's gaze never wavered, and Elliot's mind reeled, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was she here? Who was she? As if answering his unspoken question, the figure's lips parted in a slow, agonizing movement. The sound that followed was barely a whisper, but it cut through the heavy air with terrifying clarity. "Do you remember?" Elliot's blood ran cold, and he felt his stomach twist into a knot. The words echoed in his mind, bouncing off the walls, until they became a rhythmic chant in his skull. "Do you remember?" His thoughts fragmented, breaking apart like shards of glass. Something stirred deep within him. An image, a memory, vague at first, like a dream slipping just out of reach. And then it hit him. A flash of light, blinding and sharp. A fire. He could see it, smell it, the scent of burning flesh, the crackling of flames. A figure, a woman, screaming. His own hands reaching, pulling, but unable to save her. Her, the woman from the fire. Elliot stumbled back, his mind spinning, the weight of the realization crashing into him with the force of a tidal wave. This was no coincidence. The burned angel, this creature of torment and agony, was somehow tied to him, to his past, to the fire that had haunted his dreams for years. He could feel the presence of the figure intensify, her gaze growing more piercing, more oppressive. The air around him thickened, turning heavier with each passing moment. "Do you remember, Elliot?" Her voice was softer now, almost coaxing, but there was an edge to it. Something dark, something ancient. He wanted to turn away, to run, but his body was frozen, trapped in place by an unseen force. He felt as though he were drowning, his lungs tightening with each breath, the walls closing in around him. The darkness pressed against him, the very air alive with a suffocating presence that refused to let him go. The burned angel stepped forward, her wings scraping against the floor, the sound sending a jolt of panic through his chest. She was getting closer. He could feel it. And with each step she took, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The voice came again, louder now, almost a command. "Remember what you did, Elliot. Remember who you left behind." The figure's eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers. They bored into his soul, digging deeper with every passing second. A flood of images, of memories, crashed into his mind all at once. Images of fire, of screams, of faces he had tried to forget, faces that had burned away in the flames, faces he had abandoned. "No!" Elliot cried out, his voice breaking as the memories tore through him like a jagged knife. His body convulsed, his hands reaching out, grasping for something, anything to stop the torrent of pain. But it was too late. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, throwing him back into the pitch-black abyss of the hallway. Chapter 3. The Whispering Shadows. The walls of Elliot's apartment felt as though they were pressing in on him. An ever-tightening noose, the air too thick, too heavy with the remnants of that damnable presence. He stood frozen in place, his body trembling as though he had just emerged from a freezing river, every inch of him cold and wet. His breath came in shallow gasps, and the silence around him felt deafening, unnatural, as though the very world had gone still, holding its breath for what was yet to come. His eyes darted around the apartment, the familiar surroundings now twisted, warped in his mind by the image of that thing, the burned angel, her face, her hollow eyes, and the unrelenting agony etched into every part of her charred body, refused to leave him. It was as if she had planted herself deep inside his mind, a parasite feeding off the dark parts of his memory, and he could feel her presence even now, lingering at the edges of his thoughts, like smoke in a windless room. He staggered to the nearest chair and collapsed into it, his hands gripping the armrest tightly, nails digging into the worn fabric. His head swam with fragmented memories, images of fire, the smell of burning flesh, the screech of metal as it warped and bent under the heat. He tried to push them away, but they came flooding back, more vivid than ever. He could see her again, her face, her pleading eyes, the woman he had failed. No, he thought, clenching his eyes shut. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the voice, the low, guttural whisper of the burned angel, had crawled beneath his skin, and no matter how much he tried to deny it, he knew, deep down, that something had changed. The things he had left behind, the things he had ignored, were clawing their way back to the surface, and there was no escape. Not now. He felt a pressure on his chest, like an invisible hand squeezing his lungs. Panic set in. His breath hitched, and his vision blurred as the room seemed to pulse, the walls breathing in time with his heart. The flickering of the light overhead added to the madness, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own, stretching and warping, writhing like snakes on the floor. It was her again, the burned angel. She had not left him. She had followed him, and she was not alone. The shadows deepened. The whispers began, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder by the second. It was a chorus, 1,000 voices speaking at once, some human, some not, all distorted, as if they were coming from deep within the earth, from the cracks in the fabric of reality itself. Elliot. His name rang out in the darkness, echoing, reverberating off the walls until it filled the entire room. He jerked in his seat, his eyes snapping open, but there was nothing there. The apartment was empty, still, silent, save for the sound of his own frantic breathing. Yet the whispers persisted, now more insistent, clawing at his mind, digging into the corners of his consciousness like worms burrowing into rotting wood. Do you remember? Do you remember what you did? She is waiting for you. Elliot slammed his hands against his ears, but it did no good. The voices drowned him, swallowed him whole, and for a moment, he couldn't tell if they were real or if his mind had simply cracked under the pressure. He felt as if he were drowning in a sea of noise, his own heartbeat pounding in his skull. I didn't mean to, he thought desperately. I didn't mean for this to happen. The memories continued to flood back, fragments of his past that he had tried so hard to bury. He could see her face again, that woman from the fire. Her eyes, wide and terrified, locked onto his as the flames consumed everything around them. He had been too slow, too paralyzed by fear. He had watched as she screamed for help, her body writhing in the inferno. He could hear the crackling of the fire, the suffocating heat that had surrounded them, and then, the silence. He had failed her. The guilt crushed him, suffocated him, and as he sat there in his chair, his chest tightening, he realized that this torment, was his punishment. This was the price he had to pay for his cowardice. But the whispers, they were not done. Come to her, Elliot. She is waiting. The floor beneath him trembled, a faint vibration at first, but growing stronger with every passing second, until it felt as though the entire building was shaking. The walls seemed to warp and bend, their surfaces rippling like the surface of water disturbed by unseen forces. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as the apartment around him began to distort further, the edges of reality fraying like the corners of a torn piece of paper. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. And then, with a force that sent him crashing to the floor, the lights went out completely. No, not again. He scrambled to his feet, desperate to find something, anything, that would anchor him to the present, to the reality he once knew. But all he could see now was the suffocating blackness, the kind of darkness that felt alive, that pressed in on him from all sides, a living, breathing thing that wanted to swallow him whole. And then he heard it, a soft scraping sound like fingernails dragging across stone. It came from the hallway. Elliot's blood ran cold. He froze, every muscle in his body locking up. He knew, without a doubt, what it was. The burned angel was here. Her presence loomed just beyond the apartment door, as if she were waiting for him, watching him, her burned wings scraping against the floor like the sound of a coffin being dragged across a graveyard. Elliot? The whisper came again, now unmistakable, low and venomous. Do you remember what you left behind? His throat tightened. He knew what she was asking. He knew what she meant. The woman, the one who had died in that fire. She had been part of something far darker, far more twisted than he had ever realized. He had been a fool to think he could escape it. With trembling hands, he reached for the doorknob. He had to know. He had to see. The door creaked open on its own, as though the building itself were unwilling to let him keep the truth hidden any longer. What lay beyond was not the familiar hallway of his apartment complex. It was something else, a void, a black abyss that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were gone, replaced by swirling mists that swirled in unnatural patterns. And through the mist, he could just make out the silhouette of something, or someone, standing at the far end. The burned angel. Her body was writhing, contorting, her limbs twisting at unnatural angles, her wings stretching impossibly wide, the edges of them ragged and torn. Her face, though obscured by the smoke, held a faint smile, a grotesque mockery of joy. "Come to me, Elliot," she whispered again, her voice a soft lilt of dark promise. Elliot stood paralyzed in the doorway, the air thick with dread and guilt. He could feel the pull of her presence, like gravity, dragging him toward her, toward the darkness. It was inevitable now, and as the shadows of the hallway reached out to claim him, he finally understood the truth. There was no escape from the fire. There never had been. Chapter 4. The Veil of Fire. The apartment had grown colder over the last few days, as if the walls themselves were exhaling the chill of something ancient, something old and forgotten. Elliot had tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to the shift of the seasons, just a normal change in the air. But the air wasn't normal. There was something else there now, something lurking just beyond his reach, like an unwelcome presence standing in the corners of his vision. No matter how many lights he switched on, how many windows he opened, the shadows clung to the room like hungry fingers. The apartment felt as if it were breathing, deep, slow breaths, pulsating, as if the very foundation of the place was alive. He had thought the nightmare of the burned angel was over, that it was some fevered hallucination. But her presence had returned in fragments, hazy, fleeting images that stirred when he closed his eyes, her charred figure haunting the edges of his mind like a persistent echo. Her voice, soft, pleading, then demanding, whispered from the corners of his thoughts. "You left me to burn. You left me to die." The words had burrowed into his brain, repeating relentlessly, dragging him down into a spiral of guilt and confusion. The dream had felt so real. The ash on his hands, the overwhelming heat, the screams. His body still remembered the heat of the flames. He had woken up drenched in sweat, his sheets clinging to his skin, the scent of burnt wood in his nostrils. Elliot had been trying to focus on something, anything else. But the pull was undeniable. The burning angel, her disfigured face, her blistered skin, her voice that never ceased. She was with him, lingering like the smoke of a fire that wouldn't go out. It was around this time that the knocks began. They came late at night, sharp, deliberate, like the rap of bone on wood. He would open the door, expecting to find nothing. But the emptiness outside grew colder, darker, the air thick with something suffocating. No one was ever there, yet he knew, deep down, that something was. Someone was watching him. That night, as the darkness pressed in, Elliot's fear reached its peak. His apartment, once a safe haven, now felt like a cage, a place where shadows moved and whispered, where something unseen lingered just at the edge of his consciousness. He'd spent the day rummaging through old boxes in his father's study, hoping to find some clue, something that would make sense of the events that had been spiraling out of control. There had to be something in his father's things. His father had always been secretive, always guarding a part of their family's history that Elliot had never fully understood. Finally, after hours of searching, Elliot uncovered an old journal, its pages yellowed, its cover cracked with age. His father's handwriting, neat and precise, filled the pages. The entries began innocently enough, recounting mundane occurrences. But as Elliot flipped through the book, the tone shifted. There were mentions of rituals, of old books and symbols, of the veil between worlds. There were scribbled warnings about doors that should never be opened, about things that should remain forgotten. And then there were the names of people who had vanished, one by one, never to be seen again. His father had been involved in something dark, something ancient. It was clear now. The fire, the one that had consumed their house years ago, had been no accident. Elliot's family had made a deal, a pact, and that pact had opened a door to something beyond. But what? What had they summoned? What had they unleashed? The final entry caught his eye. "The price is steep. We must never forget. The ones we have burned will come for us." The words sent a shiver down Elliot's spine. His hands shook as he flipped the page, hoping for some explanation, some clarity. But there were no more words, just a crude drawing. An angel, its wings charred, its face twisted in agony. The same image, the same figure he had seen in his dreams. He slammed the journal shut, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The room seemed to darken around him, the shadows closing in. Elliot's pulse quickened, his body trembling. He couldn't escape the feeling that he wasn't alone. The knock at the door came again, louder this time, more insistent. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. He didn't want to answer it. He didn't want to face whatever was waiting on the other side. but his legs moved before his mind could protest. He reached for the door handle, the cold metal sending a jolt through his body. With a deep breath, Elliot opened the door. There was no one there, just the hallway. Empty. Except for the faint mist creeping along the floor, swirling like smoke in the stillness of the air. The temperature seemed to drop even further, the cold seeping into his bones. Elliot stepped into the hallway, his breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. "Come to us, Elliot." The voice was low, soft, but it made his blood run cold. It came from the shadows, from the dark corners of the hall where the mist seemed to grow thicker. "You cannot run from what you have done." The voice, faint but growing louder, was unmistakable now. He recognized it, the voice of the angel, her words drenched in sorrow and fury. Elliot's head spun as his body moved instinctively forward. He couldn't fight it, couldn't resist. Something was pulling him toward the darkness. His feet carried him further down the hall, his mind screaming at him to stop, but his body ignored the warning. The walls of the hallway seemed to stretch, the ceiling rising higher, the floor growing farther away. It felt as if the very structure of the building was bending, warping, as if it was becoming something else, something alive. And then he saw her, the burned angel. She stood at the far end of the hall, her charred wings spread wide, her face contorted in pain, her body twitching and jerking as though it were being pulled in multiple directions at once. Her eyes, once hollow, were now alight with an unnatural fire, her gaze fixed on him. "You left me to burn," she whispered, her voice filled with a hollow desperation. Elliot's heart thudded painfully in his chest, the air thickening with each step he took. Her face twisted with rage as she took a step toward him. "You abandoned me, Elliot. You didn't save me. You didn't even try." Her voice grew louder, more insistent, filling the entire hallway, reverberating in his mind, drowning out all other sound. Elliot's stomach twisted, his knees shaking as he tried to move back, but it was as if the floor had turned to quicksand, pulling him in. "What do you want from me?" Elliot managed to gasp, his voice breaking with fear. The angel's twisted mouth curved into a semblance of a smile, a sickening grin that sent a fresh wave of terror flooding through him. "Your soul, Elliot. Your soul, and the price your family has yet to pay." Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth of what had happened, of what he had been running from all these years. The fire that had consumed his family's past, the pact his father had made, the price they had paid, it had all led him here. To this moment, to this fate. "The door has been opened, Elliot," she said, her voice soft but deadly. "And now, it can never be closed." The shadows closed in around him. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, all seemed to collapse inward, pressing against him as if the very house were alive, suffocating him, trapping him in its grasp. The angel's face loomed closer, the fire in her eyes burning hotter. And then, just as he felt he could take no more, the apartment fell silent. The shadows receded. The mist disappeared. The angel was gone. Elliot stood there, his heart hammering in his chest, his body covered in a cold sweat. His hands shook as he reached out to touch the walls, feeling the vibrations still reverberating in the air. He was no longer alone. There was no escaping the price. There was no escaping the burned angel, and whatever had been unleashed was now coming for him. Chapter 5. The Weight of Ashes. The sun had long since set, leaving behind an oppressive darkness that hung like a heavy veil over the world. Elliot sat in his apartment, the flickering glow of the single candle on the table casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The city outside was eerily quiet, as if it too were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. The events of the past few weeks had left him on the edge of sanity. The angel's voice, its rasping whispers, its relentless demands, hadn't ceased. It followed him everywhere, a constant presence at the edge of his mind. The burned angel wasn't just a nightmare anymore. She had become his reality. The apartment, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on him every night, as if the very foundation of the building had turned against him. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, one that gnawed at his bones and made it impossible to sleep. There were times when he could have sworn he saw her, the angel, standing at the end of the hallway, watching him with those hollow, burning eyes. But every time he tried to approach, the vision would vanish, slipping into the darkness like smoke. No, it wasn't just a vision. She was real. She was real. It had all started with the knock, the first knock that sent his blood running cold. Since then, the sounds had become more frequent, more insistent. They were never the same, always varied in their cadence, as though someone or something was testing the boundaries of his sanity. Sometimes it would be the sharp rap of knuckles on wood. Other times the soft creaking of the door as though something were trying to push its way in. But each time Elliot opened the door, there was nothing. Nothing but the emptiness, the stillness, and the cold that seemed to cling to everything. But that cold had begun to seep into his soul, chilling him to the core. And then there was the feeling, an overwhelming, suffocating presence in the apartment. It was as if something had come alive inside these walls. The air would grow thick and heavy, pressing against him, suffocating him. His breath would catch in his throat. His heart would race and his thoughts would grow jumbled, scattered. He had started to avoid the mirrors, afraid of what he might see staring back at him. He couldn't look at himself anymore, not after what he had learned about his family, about his father's secret, the journal, the rituals, the deal that had been struck. He was bound to this nightmare, whether he wanted to be or not. It was in his father's study, hidden beneath a pile of old letters and forgotten documents, that Elliot had found the truth about the pact his father had made, the doors they had opened, and the things that they had called forth. The journal had been his father's, and it detailed everything, everything, from the rituals they had performed to the warnings they had ignored. The final entry had been the most chilling. The price is steep. We must never forget. The ones we have burned will come for us. Elliot had been determined to understand, to uncover the mystery behind his family's history. But the more he delved, the more he realized the truth was far worse than he could ever have imagined. The burned angel was not just a ghost or a figment of his imagination. She was a part of something ancient, something far more powerful than he could comprehend. And now, she was here. That night, as the wind howled outside and the rain beat against the windows, Elliot sat by the candle, his hands trembling. He had tried to rationalize everything, tried to tell himself it was all just a product of his fear, a result of his mind unraveling. But deep down, he knew better. There was something real happening here, something that had crossed over into his world. The knock came again. It was softer this time, a slow, deliberate rapping on the door, like the tapping of a skeletal finger. Elliot's pulse quickened. He didn't want to open the door. He didn't want to face whatever was out there, whatever was waiting for him. But he knew deep down that he had no choice. The door had already been opened, and there was no going back. With shaky hands, he reached for the doorknob. The moment his fingers brushed against the cold metal, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath came out in visible clouds, and the candle's flame flickered wildly before sputtering out. The darkness grew deeper, thickening around him like a living thing. He opened the door. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty, shrouded in darkness. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood, and a strange hum seemed to pulse from deep within the walls. Elliot's heart raced in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out across his brow. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was there, watching. The mist began to rise, swirling at his feet, curling around his ankles like tendrils of smoke. He took a step forward, but the floor beneath him felt wrong, soft, unstable, as if it were shifting beneath his weight. He stumbled, nearly losing his balance, but somehow kept his footing. His eyes darted around the hallway, but there was no sign of anyone, no sign of the angel. And then he heard it, the soft, guttural whisper. "You cannot escape me, Elliot." The voice was close, impossibly close, yet there was no one there. He whipped around, trying to locate the source, but the hallway remained as empty as ever. "You burned me." Elliot froze. The voice. It was hers. The burned angel's voice. But how could it be? He had seen her in his dreams, had felt the heat of the fire on his skin, had heard her pleading cries. But now the voice was inside his head, a constant whisper, a cold breeze that cut through him like a blade. "You left me to die, Elliot." The floor beneath his feet groaned, the sound of something heavy shifting beneath the building. Elliot looked down, his heart racing, his hands trembling. The mist thickened, coiling around his legs like a living thing, pulling him forward, deeper into the darkness. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, to flee, to do anything to escape this nightmare. But his body refused to obey. He was moving forward, step by step, drawn into the unknown by the whispering voice. You cannot escape what you have done. Elliot stumbled forward, his body numb, his mind in a haze. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in on him, suffocating him with their oppressive weight. The air was thick with the smell of ash, the faint echo of screams reverberating through his skull. And then, as if by some twisted fate, he found himself standing before the door to the apartment's old, forgotten room, the one room his father had forbidden him to enter, the one room that had always been locked, always sealed shut. The key his father had hidden away in the drawer. Elliot fumbled in his pocket, his fingers cold and numb, before he found it. The cold metal of the key felt like ice in his palm, and for a moment he hesitated. But then the whisper came again, stronger now, more urgent. Open the door, Elliot. And so he did. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the empty apartment, a sound that seemed to reverberate in the deepest corners of his soul. The room was dark, suffocatingly so, but as his eyes adjusted, he began to make out the shapes inside. The walls were lined with old books, their spines cracked and yellowed with age. Strange symbols were scrawled across the walls, and in the center of the room was a single wooden chair, its surface worn, its legs twisted and splintered. And then, at the far end of the room, he saw her, the burned angel. She was standing in the shadows, her body contorted, her wings spread wide in a grotesque mockery of flight. The fire that had consumed her once was still burning, deep within her eyes, and as they locked onto his, Elliot felt a wave of panic rush over him. You cannot run, Elliot. He tried to speak, tried to plead, but no words came. His throat was dry, his voice lost to the suffocating fear that gripped him. He stepped forward, one foot dragging after the other, as though his body were moving on its own accord. The closer he got, the stronger the smell of ash became, the thicker the darkness around him. I gave you a chance, Elliot, she whispered, her voice low and heavy. But now, you will burn. The room seemed to shift, the walls closing in on him, the floor beneath him beginning to crumble. Elliot's chest tightened as the weight of the ash settled over him, pressing down, suffocating him. The angel's burned form flickered, her face shifting in and out of focus. And then, as if the very world had broken apart, everything went dark. Chapter 6. The Price of Silence. The morning arrived like a wound, slow and jagged, as though the sun itself had hesitated before rising. Elliot sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the worn floorboards beneath him, his mind reeling from the horrors of the night before. He had woken up, but he wasn't certain if he had truly escaped the nightmare, or if the world around him was simply another layer of it. The burned angel had never left. She hovered in the corners of his mind, in every shadow, in every creak of the old apartment building. He could feel her now, her presence so suffocating that it was as though the air had turned to smoke, thick with ash and the stench of death. The room felt different today, alive. It was no longer just the oppressive silence that gripped him, but something far darker, something far more. Elliot could feel her watching him from behind the walls. That voice, the whispering that had clawed its way into his thoughts for days now, was closer than it had ever been. It felt like her fingers were in his skull, turning, twisting, digging into the fabric of his very being. But what unsettled him the most was how quiet she had become. The silence was a weight, a pressure on his chest, heavy and unyielding. She had given him no demands for hours, no taunting whispers in the darkness. No voice at all. It was worse than the tormenting words, the threats that filled his nights. At least then he could hear her, feel her presence, could prepare himself for the next onslaught. But now it was different. Her silence gnawed at him, hollowing him out from the inside. He got up from the bed, moving with the heaviness of someone who had been awake for far too long. The apartment was cold. The chill that hung in the air made his breath visible in front of him, drifting in wisps like ghosts of things that shouldn't be there. He walked through the apartment, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The windows were closed, the blinds pulled shut. No breeze, no sound of the city outside. There was only the soft scrape of his footsteps against the floor. The only sound in the world. He was utterly alone. Yet, in that very solitude, he could hear her. "Elliot!" The whisper broke through his thoughts like a blade through paper. It was sharp, jagged, and unmistakable. His entire body froze. He turned toward the voice, his eyes flicking around the room, seeking out the source. She was there, somewhere. "Elliot, you are forgetting. You are forgetting what you owe." Her words were laced with an ancient malice, the kind that came from the deepest parts of the earth. Elliot's chest tightened, a wave of nausea washing over him. He wanted to run, to tear down the walls and flee, but he knew he couldn't. There was no escape. She had rooted herself inside him, burrowed beneath his skin. Her whispers were woven into the very fabric of his thoughts, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't outrun her. He clenched his fists, pressing them to his ears as if he could block her voice out. But it was no use. It was in his mind, echoing in his skull, louder than the pounding of his own heart. "The price you pay for silence is steep, Elliot." Her words were no longer a whisper. They were an echo, a ring that filled the room, rattling the windows and trembling the walls. He could feel her presence, the heat of it, radiating from the corners of the room as if the walls themselves were breathing. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He had to get out. He had to get away. The air around him felt thick, too thick to swallow. It was pressing in on him, pushing him down toward the floor. He staggered, his knees buckling beneath him, and before he could catch himself, he crashed to the ground. The room spun, his vision blurred, and then he heard it again. "The price of silence, Elliot. You know what you have done. You cannot silence me forever." Her voice wasn't coming from the walls now. It was coming from within him. It was a feverish pulse in his veins, a torment that burned through his bones. He could feel her, the weight of her, the rage that simmered just below the surface of his mind, waiting to break free. "You will remember, Elliot. You will remember all of it. The fire, the pact, the sacrifice." A vision flooded his mind, one he hadn't allowed himself to see for years. It was the old house, the one his father had brought them to all those years ago, the place where it all began. He remembered it clearly now, how his father had looked as he performed the ritual, the strange symbols drawn on the floor in a circle, the candles that flickered with a life of their own, the chants that filled the air like a storm. His father had been so calm, so sure of what he was doing, as if this was the natural course of things. But Elliot had known something was wrong. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, like the pull of gravity in reverse. It was wrong. Everything was wrong. But his father had insisted, had told him it was necessary, that they had no choice but to complete it. It was only later, much later, when Elliot had come to understand the price his father had paid. The pact. The deal. The sacrifice that had bound their family to this ancient force. And in that sacrifice, in that moment of power, Elliot had been a part of it. He had participated. He had helped. But what had they really called into the world? What had they unleashed? The answer came to him now, as clear and sharp as the pain in his chest. The burned angel. She had been the price. The burning, twisted figure he had seen in his nightmares. The one that had clawed its way into his soul. She had come through the ritual, born of fire and ash, a thing of unimaginable rage and vengeance. She had been their payment. And now she was coming for him. She was already here. The darkness in the room seemed to pulse, a steady rhythm that matched the beat of his heart. His breath came in short gasps, his pulse racing as the vision of the past and the horrors of the present merged into one. He could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. His mind was fracturing, splitting apart at the seams, as the weight of his actions pressed down on him like 1,000 tons of stone. "You think you can hide, Elliot," the voice whispered again, closer now. "But I am inside you. I am part of you. And when the time comes, you will beg for it to end." The words echoed in his ears, louder now, deafening. It felt like the walls were closing in on him, suffocating him. He couldn't think, couldn't see. All he could do was hear her, her voice like claws dragging against his brain, pulling him deeper and deeper into the void. I am the fire that burns in your veins, Elliot. The ashes you've carried all your life. You will not escape. The room seemed to tilt. Elliot's vision blurred. His body was no longer his own, every part of him locked in a struggle he couldn't win. And then, with one final deafening scream, the apartment was plunged into absolute darkness. Chapter 7. The Whispered Descent. Elliot awoke in a place that didn't feel like waking. His eyes snapped open, but there was no immediate shift in his surroundings. The darkness had a thickness to it, almost tangible, like a living thing that hovered in the room with him. He felt an oppressive weight on his chest. He was awake, but the line between dream and reality had blurred beyond recognition. The air smelled of burnt paper, a faint scent of sulfur clinging to every inch of the room, suffocating and bitter. The shadows stretched unnaturally, pulling inwards like black tendrils. He could still hear her. Always, her voice whispered, a constant hum at the edge of his consciousness, like a fog that refused to lift. The burned angel. Her presence was everywhere, inside and out, woven into the very air he breathed. And now, she was here, in the room with him, her unblinking stare scorching through his thoughts. He tried to move, but his limbs felt like stone. There was no escape. The weight was too great. His muscles screamed in protest, but no matter how hard he fought, he couldn't tear himself free from the invisible chains that held him in place. You think this is over, Elliot? Her voice, sweet yet venomous, slipped through his ears like a razor, slicing through his sanity. It has only just begun. Elliot's heart hammered against his ribs, the pulse in his throat thick and erratic. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the silence around him had already swallowed the sound of his voice. It was as though the air itself had turned to quicksand, pulling him deeper, every breath a battle. The burned angel's form flickered before him in the blackness, her shape never quite solidifying but always there, an impossible distortion of flame and ash. The flickers of her outline shifted, flickering like the last embers of a fire that refused to die. Her face, if it could be called that, was a grotesque mask of melted skin, half-formed and decayed, a twisted parody of beauty. The smile that split her features was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally, as if her face itself had been torn open. Her eyes were hollow, but the depths of them burned with an endless hunger. She was the embodiment of decay, of destruction, of all the things that had been lost to time and regret. Do you remember, Elliot? Do you remember what you've done? The question rang out again, more insistent, the tone sharp and cruel. She was relentless, a creature of torment and anguish, a nightmare birthed from his darkest fears. But beneath the rage, beneath the hatred, there was something else, something colder, more calculating. You have come so far, haven't you? She purred. But do you know what it means to truly pay the price? The words hit Elliot like a fist to the gut. He gasped, trying to breathe through the suffocating pressure. The memories he had buried deep within himself began to surface once more, writhing like serpents, and he couldn't stop them. He couldn't stop the onslaught of images that swarmed his mind, images that he had fought for so long to forget. There was the house, his father's voice chanting in a language he couldn't understand, the circle drawn in blood, the fire that had consumed everything, the promise made, the pact sealed in the blood of his own flesh, and then the price, the cost of it all. Elliot had never truly understood it until now. The burned angel was the cost. She had always been the price. She was the thing that had been summoned, the thing that had been set loose upon the world. But she wasn't just a consequence of his actions. She was a part of him. She had always been a part of him. The realization hit him with the force of a thunderclap. I will be here forever, she hissed, the words chilling his bones. Because of you. You cannot outrun me. Not now. Not ever. The room began to shift, the walls warping, twisting as if the very structure of the apartment was alive. The shadows pulsed, breathing in rhythm with Elliot's heartbeat. And in the center of it all, the angel waited, her form flickering like dying embers. She was watching him with those hollow eyes, waiting for him to break. And then, the ground trembled. A low, guttural rumble echoed through the floor beneath him, vibrating through his spine. It wasn't an earthquake. No, this was something worse, something unnatural. The walls groaned, and Elliot felt the oppressive weight of the room pressing down on him, suffocating him. "You should have listened to me when you had the chance." The burned angel's voice was a cruel lullaby, dragging him into the abyss. Suddenly, the shadows around him broke apart like glass. A searing light tore through the blackness, blinding him for a moment. When his eyes adjusted, he saw them, the figures, thousands of them, all staring at him with empty, sightless eyes. They were human, or had once been. They were trapped in the same place as him, frozen in some timeless moment, their faces contorted in agony, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, caught in a state of perpetual torment. They were ghosts, souls trapped in the ether, each one an echo of a forgotten past, condemned to exist in this endless purgatory. And at the center of them stood the angel, her twisted form now fully revealed, her wings a grotesque mess of charred feathers and burned skin. She was surrounded by the souls of the damned, her eyes glowing with an inhuman fire. She was their queen, their tormentor, and she was looking directly at Elliot, as though he were just another soul to claim. "Do you see them, Elliot?" The voice broke through his thoughts, cold and indifferent. "These are the ones who paid the price, the ones who have come before you, the ones who believed they could cheat fate, just like you. But they failed. They are mine now, as you will be." Elliot's heart raced, his body shaking as the realization sank in. He had never truly understood what had been unleashed that night, the night his father had made that fateful decision. The burned angel was more than just a curse. She was the keeper of souls, a force that fed on the broken and the damned, pulling them into her endless void. Each soul, each life, was a currency in her realm, and Elliot had been the one to unlock her prison. The price was more than he had imagined. It was a toll that would echo through time. "You will never be free, Elliot," she whispered again, her voice now a symphony of torture. "Your soul belongs to me. Forever." Elliot closed his eyes, unable to tear his gaze from the monstrosity before him. The weight of his past, the burden of his choices, crushed him beneath its enormity. He had thought he could outrun it. He had thought he could escape. But now he understood. There was no escape. He was hers. Chapter 8. The Unraveling. The air was thick with the scent of ash, an oppressive haze that clung to the edges of Elliot's lungs with every breath he took. His throat felt raw, the taste of metal and smoke lingering on his tongue as he stumbled through the remnants of his shattered reality. The ground beneath his feet was no longer solid, no longer real, but a strange ethereal fog that crept up to his ankles, curling like long fingers, pulling at him, urging him deeper into the suffocating blackness. Elliot had thought the worst was over. He had believed, even for just a fleeting moment, that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to escape this nightmare. But the burned angel's presence had twisted that fragile hope into something grotesque, a cruel mockery of his fleeting desires. She was always there, whispering to him from the corners of his mind, reminding him that there was no escape. "You cannot hide from me forever." Her voice slithered through the fog, a hushed lullaby in the back of his skull, creeping under his skin like an infection. The air around him rippled with the weight of her words, a bitter promise that hung in the heavy silence. And Elliot knew it was true. The nightmares had already started to blend into his waking moments. The lines between the dream world and reality had fractured, bleeding into one another until it was impossible to distinguish the two. The shadows whispered her name when he closed his eyes, her cursed form etched into every corner of his mind like a permanent scar. As he walked, the fog swirled around him, thickening with every step he took. It wasn't just smoke, it was something more. Alive, shifting, pulsating with a hidden malevolence. It was the manifestation of the very torment that had been gnawing at the edges of his soul ever since that fateful night. Every breath felt like he was inhaling the essence of death itself, and the oppressive weight of the atmosphere seemed to collapse inward, closing him off from everything he once knew. Suddenly, the ground before him began to tremble. The rumbling was soft at first, just a faint vibration beneath his feet, but it grew in intensity, sending shivers up his spine. The fog parted for a moment, revealing what lay ahead. A broken path that stretched infinitely into the void. A trail of scorched earth, as though something had burned its way across the land, leaving nothing but desolation in its wake. There, at the end of the path, Elliot saw her, the burned angel. She was standing tall, her distorted form impossibly still amidst the shifting shadows, as though she were part of the very landscape. Her wings, charred and ragged, stretched outward, casting long twisted shadows that reached out like claws in the darkness. Her eyes, hollow, endless pits, locked onto him with an intensity that felt like 1,000 needles piercing his chest. She didn't need to move for him to feel her presence. It was as though she was the space itself, an all-encompassing force of dread. "You've come back," she murmured, her voice a soft rasp that seemed to reverberate within his bones, vibrating the very air around him. "But do you think you are the same, Elliot? Do you think you can walk away from all that you have done?" The path beneath his feet seemed to pulse with her words, rippling outward like waves in a lake, shaking him to his core. He was too far from the real world now, too deep into this endless abyss. There was no turning back. Elliot's pulse quickened. He could feel the overwhelming weight of the situation pressing in on him, his mind a storm of confusion and fear. He had made a promise long ago. He had sealed his fate when he made that choice to step over the line, when he had welcomed her into his life without fully understanding what it would cost. And now, standing before her, in this warped, liminal space that felt like an echo of his deepest regrets, Elliot realized the truth. The angel wasn't merely a manifestation of his guilt. She was a reflection of the very essence of his soul, twisted and destroyed by the choices he had made. She was his creation, a part of him he could never escape, never outrun. "I see the truth now," Elliot muttered, his voice trembling as he tried to steady himself. "I can't run anymore." The burned angel smiled, the grotesque stretch of her lips widening, her face distorting further as though her skin were melting away with every passing second. Her presence became heavier, darker, suffocating in its magnitude. "No, Elliot," she purred. "You will never be able to outrun the things that live inside you. The price is paid, the debt is settled, but you will carry it for eternity." As her words sank in, the shadows around them began to move in earnest, coiling like snakes, writhing toward him. The air turned thick with a vile presence, and the ground beneath his feet began to split open, cracks snaking through the earth like black veins, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Elliot stumbled backward, the sensation of something crawling on the back of his neck making his skin crawl. He was surrounded now, the darkness closing in on him, the whispers of the damned rising like a chorus from the void. "Do you hear them, Elliot?" The angel's voice echoed in his mind, a maddening sound that rattled the edges of his sanity. "These are the ones who were once like you, the ones who made deals, who sold their souls for a price they couldn't afford to pay." From the darkness, the figures began to emerge. At first, they were just shadows, indistinct and blurry, their shapes flickering in the dim light. But then, as the darkness stretched further, they took form. Human shapes, but broken, deformed, twisted in ways that defied nature. Their eyes were hollow, their faces masks of anguish, their bodies contorted in unnatural angles, as though they had been trapped in this nightmare for as long as time itself. "They are your family, your ancestors, your kin. Do you see them, Elliot? Do you recognize their faces?" Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he watched the faces of those who had come before him, people he had never met, yet they felt inexplicably familiar. Each one was a piece of his past, a reflection of the curse that had been passed down through generations. The price. The thought echoed through his mind like a hammer blow, each word carrying more weight than the last. The angel was right. This wasn't just his fate, it was the legacy of everyone who had come before him. Every ancestor, every person who had ever made a similar choice, who had accepted the darkness into their soul, had paid the same price. And now, Elliot was no different. He had unlocked this cycle, this curse, and it would continue long after he was gone. The air thickened, suffocating him, and the shadows closed in tighter, their whispers rising in volume until they were all he could hear. The faces around him shifted, warping into grotesque masks of horror, as though the very spirits that had once lived had become twisted versions of themselves, lost to the eternal torment that awaited them in this hellish purgatory. "You will join them," the burned angel said, her voice now a low, guttural whisper. "You will become one of us, one of the damned." Elliot's knees buckled beneath him. The weight of her words, of his fate, crushed him, pinning him to the ground. He could feel the cold fingers of death reaching for him, pulling at the edges of his being, dragging him into the depths of her realm. But as the shadows crept closer, wrapping around him like a suffocating embrace, something inside Elliot broke. A fire, long dormant, flared to life within him. It was faint, small, just a spark in the vast sea of despair. But it was enough for him to push through the overwhelming presence that sought to consume him. "No!" Elliot screamed, his voice hoarse and broken. "I won't be a part of this. I will fight. I will destroy you." The burned angel's eyes flickered with amusement, her twisted grin widening as she stepped forward, her form shifting with the movement, her wings unfurling in a slow, deliberate arc. "You cannot destroy what is already a part of you, Elliot. You will see." The ground trembled again, and the sky above them began to crack, the dark void above splitting open like a wound, spilling fire and smoke into the air. But in that moment, Elliot understood. This was the beginning of the end. His battle wasn't just against the burned angel, it was against the very thing he had been running from all along, the darkness within himself. The end was only the beginning. Chapter 8. The unraveling continued. Elliot's breath caught in his throat, each inhale a battle against the suffocating weight of the air, thick with despair and something far darker. The smoke, the fog, it wasn't just an atmospheric veil. It was alive, a presence he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. The shadows that crept along the edges of his vision twisted into forms. Familiar faces that once belonged to his friends and family, now warped into grotesque, contorted versions of themselves. "Do you see them, Elliot?" The voice of the burned angel floated around him like a poisoned breeze. "Do you see what you've become? What you've done?" He looked around frantically, his eyes desperately trying to make sense of the phantoms that emerged from the dark, their features locked in perpetual agony. There was his father. No, it wasn't him. The man's face was pale and stretched, eyes wide and bulging, pupils dilated, as if witnessing something too horrible to comprehend. Then, a woman who could have been his mother, but her skin hung like parchment from her bones, and her lips parted in a silent scream that sent chills crawling up his spine. "What do you want from me?" Elliot choked out, his voice ragged as he struggled to breathe. His hands were shaking, and the edges of his vision blurred with terror. The burned angel did not respond immediately. Instead, the smoke around him thickened further, until it felt like a living thing, wrapping around him like suffocating tendrils. His heart raced as if it were trying to beat its way out of his chest, but all that mattered was the vision before him. The faces, the agony, the voices. His eyes darted back to the figure of the angel, her towering, horrifying presence standing tall amidst the writhing nightmare. Her wings, though burnt and tattered, still seemed to move in the ethereal wind, shifting with the grace of something more ancient than time itself. The dark silhouette of her form, both angelic and demonic, filled his senses, like a dark star in the center of a broken universe. "You have never been truly free, Elliot," she said, the words floating like a haunting echo. "You carry the sins of those who came before you, and now you will carry your own." The ground beneath him began to split, jagged cracks tearing through the soil. Fire began to leak through the fissures, fiery veins that bled out from the cracks in the world, seeping upward like blood from an open wound. The flames were not like any fire he had ever seen before. These flames burned cold, their touch more agonizing than anything he had ever imagined. They didn't offer warmth, they devoured. Elliot stumbled back, tripping over the broken earth, but it was no use. His feet were stuck in the shifting ground, like tar, dragging him deeper into the void. The sounds of the tortured spirits, those faces that had once been family, grew louder. Their mouths opened in endless wails, shrieking for help, for salvation, but it was all in vain. He couldn't help them, and he couldn't help himself. "This is your legacy, Elliot," the angel whispered, moving closer now, her presence filling the air like poison. "This is your eternity. This is the price you paid when you called to me." Elliot gripped his chest, gasping for air, feeling as if something inside him was being crushed under the weight of her words. The reality of it hit him all at once. He was not here by accident. This was no random nightmare. He had summoned this darkness into his life. Every deal he had made, every path he had chosen had led him here, to this moment of reckoning. The shadowy figures that had once been his family were now fully formed. Their hollow eyes locked onto his with a look of complete despair. They reached out to him, not with open arms, but with trembling hands that grasped at him like the very hands of death itself. "No! No!" Elliot screamed, but the words felt hollow. There was no one left to hear him, not even himself. But as the fire burned hotter and the shadows closed in, Elliot did something that surprised even himself. He fought. A sudden surge of defiance, a burst of will, rose up from deep within him. He wasn't sure where it came from. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was madness, but it felt like the last thing that was truly his. "I won't be your prisoner," he roared, his voice hoarse, yet filled with a raw intensity. He pushed against the shadows, trying to break free from the suffocating darkness that had locked him in place. His heart raced, blood pumping faster than he thought possible. The burned angel watched in silence as Elliot struggled. Her cold eyes glimmered with an eerie amusement. But there was something else there too, something almost like pity. "You think you can fight your fate?" she asked, her voice soft, taunting. "You can't escape yourself, Elliot. You can't escape the truth." Elliot stumbled back as a new wave of shadows descended upon him, their forms shifting, twisting in unnatural angles. They reached for him, grasping at his arms, his legs, pulling him into the dark void that loomed beneath him. "You belong here, Elliot," the angel's voice said again, this time softer, almost soothing. "You belong in this eternal torment." The ground beneath him began to collapse. The flames grew hotter, the very earth beneath him cracking apart, sinking into a chasm of darkness. His vision blurred with smoke and fire, and the faces, those familiar, tortured faces, began to close in around him. "There is no escape," the angel whispered. Her voice wrapped around him like a noose, tightening with each passing second. "Not for you, not for anyone who has crossed the line you crossed." But as the darkness reached out to swallow him whole, Elliot saw something. Something in the distance, something different, a flicker, a glimmer of light. It was small at first, but it grew with every passing moment. It shone through the cracks in the earth, through the suffocating fog. It was a doorway. The angel's voice grew louder, more insistent. "Don't look at it! You cannot leave!" But Elliot's eyes were fixed on the light. It beckoned him, a shining beacon of something. Hope, perhaps, or escape. The last shred of something that could save him. He fought against the shadows, against the voices, against everything that was dragging him into the abyss. He reached for the light, his fingers brushing against the cold surface of what he knew was the last chance he would ever have. And then, just as he thought he was lost forever, he slipped through. The moment he touched the light, everything changed. The shadows, the fire, the anguish. It all vanished in an instant. The air became lighter. The oppressive weight lifted from his chest. He could feel the ground beneath him again, solid and unyielding. He was standing, breathing freely, no longer drowning in the smoke and fire that had consumed him. But when Elliot opened his eyes, everything before him was unfamiliar. He was no longer in the nightmare realm of darkness and fire. Instead, he found himself standing in a vast open field. The sky was dark but calm, streaked with distant stars. In front of him was an old house, dilapidated but strangely familiar. The windows were shattered, the wood warped by time and decay. But there was something comforting about it, a feeling he couldn't quite explain, something tugging at the corners of his memory. Suddenly, he realized, this place wasn't the end. It wasn't the escape he had longed for. This was just another chapter. And as he took his first step forward, Elliot knew one thing for certain. He wasn't free. Not yet. Chapter 9. The Veil of Silence. Elliot's eyes fluttered open, his body heavy as though it had been bound in chains, his every muscle screaming in protest. The moment he regained consciousness, he felt the oppressive silence around him. It was not a silence of peace, but one of suffocating stillness. A quiet so profound it seemed to echo within his bones, reverberating with every throb of his pulse. He lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, unable to move, unable to speak, and yet somehow aware of every infinitesimal shift in the air around him. He wasn't sure how long he had been lying there. The sense of time was warped, twisted into something beyond comprehension. The last thing he remembered was the doorway, the light that had beckoned to him, pulling him away from the horrors of the burning realm he had escaped. Had he found solace on the other side, or had he merely exchanged one prison for another? The room was pitch black, save for a faint, sickly glow that seemed to pulse from the walls themselves. It wasn't light exactly, more like an unnatural shimmer, a quiet radiance that soaked through the air, casting long, malformed shadows across the room, shadows that bent unnaturally, as if they weren't quite bound by the laws of nature. A sound stirred in the distance, a low, unearthly hum that vibrated through the floorboards beneath him, vibrating deep into his chest, filling the empty silence. It sounded like whispers at first, like the distant murmur of voices that he couldn't quite make out, but the longer he listened, the more distinct the words became. Help us. It was a collective voice, fractured and overlapping, like the desperate chorus of spirits crying out for deliverance. The sound grew louder, louder still, until it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. Elliot could hear the desperation in their cries, the suffocating agony in their tones. Help us, Elliot. He tried to sit up, but his limbs felt like lead. He was anchored to the spot, tethered to something he couldn't see. Panic began to gnaw at the edges of his sanity as he strained against the invisible bonds holding him in place. His throat tightened, his breath shallow, but no matter how much he struggled, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched, scrutinized from all angles. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. You can hear us. You can feel us. We are here, Elliot. The weight of those words sank into his chest like a cold stone. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, but he forced himself to take slow, measured breaths. The walls felt like they were closing in even tighter. He had to break free. He had to move. His mind raced with the memories of the burned angel, of the torment that had followed him, and the fractured reality he had somehow been cast into. But something deep within him was telling him that this place, this silence, was far worse than the fire, worse than the darkness that had threatened to consume him. The walls seemed to pulse around him, drawing closer with every breath, pressing in on him like the very air was thickening, crushing him under its weight. He tried again to move, forcing himself to push his hands against the cold floor. His fingers scraped against something rough and uneven. The sensation was alien, unnatural, as though the ground beneath him was alive. Suddenly, the hum of the voices stopped. Elliot froze. The silence returned, even more deafening than before. There was no sound at all, no hum, no whisper, only an unbearable stillness that seemed to stretch out into eternity. And then, a new sound broke the silence. A slow, deliberate footstep, the faintest creak of wood underfoot, coming from the far corner of the room. Elliot's heart slammed against his ribcage. He wasn't alone. Another footstep, closer. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't make a sound. The air was thick with the presence of something. Something that should not be there. Something that watched him with unseen eyes. His skin prickled with a deep primal fear, the kind of fear that rises when you know you are at the mercy of something far beyond your control. The footsteps stopped. The tension in the air was unbearable. Elliot's entire being was coiled tight, like a spring wound too far, ready to snap. But there was nothing but the heavy silence, so profound that it felt like the very space around him had been frozen in time. And then, from the shadows, a voice. "Do you remember?" It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the air like a blade. Elliot couldn't place the voice, but it was familiar. It felt like it had been with him forever, a presence he had known long before this moment, a voice that had been with him in the depths of his dreams, in the quietest corners of his mind. "Do you remember the price you paid?" The words sent a chill running through him, as though they had scraped against something deep within his soul, something long buried, something he had tried to forget. A cold breeze brushed against his face, though there was no window, no opening in the room to allow for such a draft. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded, only grew stronger. Elliot strained to push himself up, his arms shaking with the effort. His legs felt like jelly, weak and unresponsive, but he had to move. He had to escape. But the more he tried, the more the room seemed to shift, the more the walls bent inward, closing him in. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The voice spoke again, and this time it was louder, more insistent. "You cannot hide from your past, Elliot." A figure appeared from the shadows, a silhouette at first, indistinct, but growing clearer with each passing moment. A figure cloaked in darkness, its face hidden, but a shape, unmistakable, looming before him. "You called to me." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The words sent a shiver down his spine. He had called to them, yes. He had summoned this. He had invited this nightmare into his life. And now it was here. The figure stepped closer, and Elliot could finally see it. A tall, angular shape, its body cloaked in shadows. But the face, that face, was something he could never have imagined. The eyes were wide and unblinking, dark pools that seemed to stare straight through him into the deepest recesses of his soul. Its mouth, thin and contorted, twisted into a smile that was both mocking and sadistic, as though it knew something Elliot didn't. "Do you regret it now, Elliot?" The voice, impossibly soft and sweet, purred through the air like poison on a breeze. "Do you regret the price you paid?" Elliot recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, the weight of the memories crashing down on him in a torrential flood. The deals he had made, the promises he had broken, the things he had done to get here. Elliot's voice faltered. "I didn't know. I didn't know it would be like this." The figure's smile widened, and the room seemed to grow colder still. The shadows deepened around it, swirling like smoke. "But you do now, don't you?" Elliot's mind was drowning in the horror, in the weight of the choices he had made. And yet, despite it all, there was something else, something faint, something fleeting, a flicker of hope, a way out perhaps, but at what cost? The figure stepped closer still, and Elliot felt a cold hand press gently against his chest, a pressure that seemed to draw all the warmth from his body, leaving only emptiness in its wake. "You belong to me now, Elliot." The words lingered in the air, hanging over him like a curse. And then, with a final, haunting whisper, the figure vanished, leaving only the suffocating silence in its wake. Chapter 9. The Veil of Silence continued. Elliot's body trembled, his breath caught in his throat. The figure had vanished, but its presence lingered, like an echo of something far darker that had been unleashed. His eyes darted around the room, desperate for a clue, any shred of reality to tether him back to something solid, something real. But the more he searched, the more it seemed that reality itself was slipping through his fingers. The air felt thick now, unnaturally thick, like he was swimming in a pool of frozen liquid. It was suffocating. His lungs burned as if he were inhaling ice, each breath like swallowing shards of glass. He gasped, struggling to fill his chest with air, But the more he struggled, the less his body seemed to respond. His hands were numb. His heart felt as though it was dragging behind him, a distant beat, a fading rhythm in a world that was losing its pulse. "You belong to me now, Elliot." The words repeated in his mind, a mantra of inevitability. He tried to push them away, but they clung to him like a shadow that he couldn't shake off. He wasn't sure if the voice had been real or if it was just a phantom that had taken root in his mind. But either way, it was there, inside him, around him, suffocating him. The silence that followed was a cruel mockery, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something he could not name. Elliot stumbled forward, his legs shaky, refusing to obey his will. He reached for the nearest wall, his fingers scraping against the rough surface, his nails digging into the cracks like they were the only thing keeping him tethered to this realm. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their surface undulating like the skin of some vast creature, and Elliot could feel the heat rising from within. The temperature was rising, oppressive, as if the room was alive and breathing, waiting. With every step, the shadows seemed to grow, stretching longer, darker. The faint pulse of light that had once seemed sickly now felt like it was drawing him in, pulling him toward the center of the room where the shadows gathered thickest, like a vortex, just waiting to consume him whole. He closed his eyes, squeezing them shut as though he could block out the sight. But the sound of the pulse, the hum, the whispers, they followed him. They dug into his skull, crawling into his thoughts, poisoning his mind. It was a sound like no other, a dull, throbbing noise that resonated deep in his bones, like something ancient and terrible, vibrating from the depths of the earth. "You should have known," the voice said again, only this time it wasn't a whisper. It was sharp, jagged, like the sound of glass shattering. "You thought you could escape, didn't you? But you can never escape the past. It always finds you." Elliot's hand slid along the wall until it touched something that felt like metal, cold, slick, unnatural. He froze. His fingertips brushed over what seemed to be an etching. Symbols, ancient and warped, carved into the surface. They pulsed with the same faint light as the walls, glowing with an energy that made his blood run cold. The symbols seemed to shift beneath his touch, twisting, changing, becoming something else entirely, something more sinister. The floor beneath him began to rumble, the vibrations growing stronger, like the heartbeat of some great dormant beast waking from slumber. Elliot's heart raced as the room seemed to tremble with it, as though everything was shaking from the inside out. "You're too late," the voice coiled around him, this time so close it was like it was breathing directly into his ear. "The door is open. The veil is torn." A flash of cold washed over him, and for the briefest of moments Elliot could see something, or someone, in the distance. It was a shape, blurred, flickering in and out of view, like a mirage. His pulse quickened, and without thinking, he moved toward it. He couldn't explain it, but something about that shape, that distant figure, pulled at him, drawing him closer. He couldn't resist. He had to see. As he walked, the space around him seemed to shift, warping and contorting like a nightmare where the rules of reality no longer applied. The room felt like it was bending, stretching in impossible ways, and Elliot felt as though he were walking through a tunnel that was being pulled tight around him. The walls loomed in closer, the ceiling sinking down, as if to swallow him whole. The figure became clearer the closer he got, its outline sharpening until he could make out the form. A woman, standing tall and motionless, her face hidden by a veil of darkness, her features obscured by the same sickly glow that illuminated the room. Her presence was suffocating, her silence louder than the most deafening scream. Elliot stopped just short of her. His breath was ragged, his body trembling with the intensity of whatever force he was now standing in the middle of. There was something deeply familiar about her, but the familiarity was twisted, warped, distorted into something he couldn't quite place. The woman, if that's what she was, slowly raised her head. The veil of darkness lifted, revealing a face that sent a chill running down Elliot's spine. The eyes, wide and unblinking, were empty sockets, hollow pits of black. Her skin was pale, stretched tight over her bones, her mouth a thin line that trembled with an otherworldly hunger. Her expression was devoid of emotion, but it wasn't empty. No, there was something else there, something Elliot couldn't name. Elliot! The woman spoke his name, her voice a soft, melodic whisper that carried with it an unbearable weight. It was as if every syllable was wrapped in 1,000 years of sorrow, 1,000 years of secrets that had been buried too deep to ever be unearthed. You shouldn't have come here. Elliot's heart clenched in his chest. He wanted to move, to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot, his body unwilling to obey. The shadows twisted around him, crawling up his legs like living things. And as the woman stepped closer, the temperature in the room dropped. His breath came out in foggy bursts, his vision blurring in the cold. This place, she continued, her voice growing darker, more insistent. It calls to you. It calls to everyone who dares to step into its grasp. A cold wind seemed to whip around them, though there was no visible source. It howled through the room, carrying with it the faint sound of distant whispers, voices that were familiar, yet alien, like fragments of a memory he had forgotten. They echoed through his mind, bringing with them images of things he could not bear to remember. The burned angel, the price he had paid, the souls he had forsaken. The woman's eyes never left him as she took another step forward. Elliot felt the pressure building in his chest, as though the air itself had turned to stone. And with every inch she moved, the weight grew heavier, more unbearable. You will learn, Elliot, she whispered, her voice like a death rattle. You will learn that there are places where souls go to die, places where even the dead cannot escape. Elliot's pulse thundered in his ears as the room spun around him. The walls were closing in, the shadows rising, the temperature plummeting. And through it all, the woman stood before him, her eyes never blinking, never turning away, as though she was the very essence of this place, its guardian, its creator. He could feel it now, the truth settling over him like a dark, suffocating blanket. The room, the figure, the voices, it was all connected. This was no ordinary place. No, this was something ancient, something old, a realm that existed outside of time, outside of space, a place where the past and the present intertwined, where the living and the dead were one and the same. And Elliot had made the fatal mistake of entering it. The woman stepped closer once more, her cold breath brushing against his face, and Elliot's body screamed for him to move, to flee, but his feet refused to obey. You've crossed the threshold, she said softly, her voice like the whisper of a fading dream. And now you belong to it. And as the last words left her lips, the world around him seemed to fall away, and Elliot was pulled into the darkness once again. Chapter 10. The Depths of the Forgotten. Elliot felt himself sinking deeper into the shadows, his every movement sluggish, as though the air had thickened with a weight of eternity. His heart thundered in his chest, the rhythmic pulse drowning out all other sound, until it felt as though it was the only thing keeping him tethered to whatever was left of reality. But even that was fading. Reality itself was beginning to slip away, unraveling at the edges like the fabric of a dream. The woman stood before him, a spectre of death cloaked in the deepest shadows. Her eyes, hollow and endless, bore into him with a quiet malevolence, and though she said nothing more, her gaze alone spoke volumes. It was as though she had already seen everything, every mistake, every sin, every desperate prayer that Elliot had whispered into the night. You think you can escape this place? Her voice, a chilling whisper, cut through the thick silence. You think your memories will save you. Your remorse will not protect you here. Elliot opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. They were stuck somewhere deep in his throat, lodged behind the fear that consumed him. It wasn't just fear, it was dread, an ancient terror that had no name. A terror born from places not meant to be seen by human eyes. He tried to take a step back, but his legs refused to obey him. The ground beneath his feet was solid, yet it felt as though it was shifting, moving, alive. The darkened walls seemed to pulse, breathing in tandem with the slow rhythmic hum that filled the air, vibrating with a sound that made his bones ache. The woman's presence seemed to fold the space around him, pressing in, pushing him to the edge of something Far worse. You've already crossed the line, the woman said again, her voice like ice scraping against metal. The door is open, and now the past will come for you. His mind was awash with fragmented memories, flashes of faces he couldn't remember, of whispers he couldn't quite catch. He thought of his childhood, the innocence he had once clung to so desperately. He thought of the night he had first heard the voice, the terrible whisper that had dragged him into this world of horrors. The memories danced just beyond his reach, like a twisted game of hide and seek. He could feel them, but they were always just out of view. The air around him grew colder still, the temperature plunging to an impossible degree. His breath came out in frosty clouds, a visible sign of the grip this place had on him. And as the cold seeped deeper into his skin, he realized with a sinking certainty that it wasn't just the temperature that was freezing him. It was something far more sinister, something that had its roots deep within his soul. He wanted to scream, to beg for release, but there was no escape. Not now. The shadows stretched before him, folding like liquid darkness. The woman took a step forward, her feet making no sound on the cold floor. She glided toward him, her figure swaying with an unnatural grace. Her movements were fluid, yet terrifyingly slow, as though time itself bent to her will. "The price has already been paid," she said, her lips barely moving as her words formed. "But you're not the one who will pay it, not in the way you think. No, the price was paid long ago, by someone else." Elliot's pulse quickened, but he couldn't understand. He was no longer sure of anything. The room, if it could even be called a room anymore, seemed to stretch infinitely. The walls that had once been solid and unyielding now flowed like water, like liquid stone, as though they were alive, breathing. The floor beneath him cracked and groaned, the sound like a death rattle. The woman's eyes never left him, and the closer she came, the less he could breathe, the more his chest felt like it was closing in. She was like a storm, an inevitable, destructive force, and with each step she took, the darkness behind her deepened, stretching out like a gaping maw. She reached him, her hand, cold as death itself, brushing against his cheek. The touch sent a shock of ice through his veins, freezing him to the core. His body went rigid, unable to move, unable to speak. "Do you understand now?" she asked, her voice a whisper that seemed to echo from 1,000 different places at once. "This is not a punishment, Elliot. It's a consequence." The word hung in the air like a curse. Consequence. His body trembled, and the world around him seemed to blur. Elliot fought against the frozen grip of the darkness that surrounded him, but his thoughts scattered like broken glass, each shard spinning into madness. There was no escape from the past that had been clawing at him for so long. "You were always meant to be here." The words came from behind him, from deep within the shadows. Elliot spun around, desperate to locate the source, but he saw only darkness. There was nothing, just the oppressive weight of it pressing in on him from all sides. He staggered backward, but his feet were frozen in place, the ground beneath him now slick with ice. The woman's laughter echoed in his ears, low and mournful, a sound that was at once familiar and utterly alien. It resonated in his chest like a funeral bell, tolling the death of all hope. "This world," she whispered, "is not for the living." Elliot's vision began to darken, the edges of his sight curling into blackness. The cold was unbearable now, and he could feel his body starting to lose its warmth, its life. He was drowning in the icy grip of the woman's touch, her influence pulling him deeper into the heart of the darkness. And as his eyes closed, just for a moment, he thought he saw something, a flash of movement, of something alive in the shadows, but it was gone before he could catch it. In that fleeting moment, he realized the truth. This place was not just a prison. It was a tomb that held more than just his body. It held his soul, and the woman who stood before him, the one who called the darkness, was not just a warden. She was its keeper. The last breath left his body, the last pulse of warmth fading into nothingness, as the shadows closed in around him. Chapter 10. The Depths of the Forgotten. Part 2. Elliot's eyes fluttered open again, though the world he saw felt far more alien than it had before. The darkness was thick, suffocating. a dense fog that pressed in on him from every direction. It was as though the air itself had become something viscous, a living thing that clung to his skin and made it difficult to breathe. The space around him was no longer a room, it was something far worse. It felt like the very fabric of existence had been twisted, warped by something ancient and malevolent. He was standing, or at least he thought he was, on what appeared to be a flat, featureless surface. It felt like stone, but smoother than any surface he had ever encountered, almost slippery. There was no echo of his footsteps, no sound. The silence was deafening, a pressing weight that threatened to crush his sanity. Was he still alive? The question hung in his mind like a knife. The sensation of breathing, the frantic thumping of his heart, the trembling of his body, they all seemed so fleeting. He was unsure. He had crossed a threshold, and now he was adrift, caught between worlds, suspended in a place where nothing was real but the overwhelming presence of something else, something waiting. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as though they belonged to someone else. He reached out, his hand brushing against the air before him. His fingers froze mid-motion. The temperature had dropped again, and the coldness that seeped into his bones felt like a death that wasn't quite ready to come. In the distance, if it could even be called distance, there was a figure, or something that resembled a figure, rising from the depths of the shadowed void. It was a shape, but no shape. A darkness that gave form to itself and then took it away. It hovered in and out of perception like a flickering candle in a windless room, wavering in the impossible depths of the void. Elliot's body tensed instinctively, but his eyes couldn't look away. It was growing larger. Slowly but inexorably, it expanded, stretching outward in all directions. The closer it came, the colder the air became, the more suffocating it felt. He could feel it drawing closer, its presence pressing on his mind, as though it were reaching into him, scraping away everything that made him human. A voice, soft and distorted, pierced the silence. It wasn't the woman this time, but a whisper from the depths, a voice he didn't recognize, yet it felt all too familiar. "You have returned." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He staggered, his hands coming to rest against the cold surface beneath him as he struggled to remain upright. "What is this place?" he croaked, the sound of his own voice strange and foreign, as though it didn't belong in his mouth. There was no immediate response. The darkness seemed to pulse with an unsettling rhythm, a slow, steady heartbeat that matched the throbbing in his chest. It was a sound that was neither natural nor human, a sound that reverberated through his bones, filling him with a gnawing sense of dread. Then, the figure spoke again, its voice a mixture of sorrow and malevolence. "It is the space between worlds, the forgotten place, the place where all things lost are kept, where the dead are forgotten, and where the living come to learn of their own truth." Elliot's mind reeled. The dead? A chill ran through him, and for the first time, he understood the full weight of the horror that had been closing in on him. He had crossed a line, past a point of no return. This was not merely a realm of shadows. It was something much worse. It was a place for those who had been abandoned, left to drift through the endless, formless expanse of the forgotten. And he was one of them now. The figure seemed to grow clearer as it moved forward. It was not human, nor was it something that could be described easily. The shape flickered in and out of focus, shifting like a shadow made of smoke. The longer Elliot stared at it, the more distorted it became, until it felt as though his mind was being drawn into its very essence, sucked into the thing itself. But despite its shifting form, Elliot could feel its eyes on him. Its gaze was intense, burning, even though it had no physical eyes. It knew him, in a way that transcended recognition. It knew the darkness inside him, the guilt that had gnawed at his soul. He couldn't escape it, even if he tried. "You belong here," the voice said again, the words slipping under his skin like poison. "You've always belonged here. You sought the forgotten, and the forgotten have found you." Panic rose in Elliot's chest, but it was a distant thing, distant and out of his control. The more he struggled, the more his thoughts began to fragment. He couldn't think clearly, couldn't form coherent thoughts. His consciousness seemed to slip between moments, fleeting and uncertain, like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. "What do you want from me?" he managed to rasp, his voice trembling. There was no immediate answer. The figure seemed to pause, as though considering him. Then it spoke, its voice softer, more intimate now. "You don't understand yet, do you? You have been called. You've always been called. Your soul was never meant to rest." Elliot wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but his body refused him. His chest tightened, his breath becoming shallow and ragged as the figure continued to loom closer, the very air growing heavy with its oppressive presence. He felt himself sinking further, deeper into the darkness, as though the ground beneath him were giving way. The voice, now almost a whisper, came once more. "You are the last one, Elliot, the last to wake, the last to know. The others, they have forgotten. But you remember. You always will." The ground beneath Elliot's feet trembled, and the world around him seemed to dissolve, fading into the blackness that pressed in from every side. The edges of his vision blurred, the shadows distorting into terrifying shapes that crawled and writhed, hungry for him, for his soul. In the distance, he thought he heard the woman's voice again, softer now, almost like a lullaby. "The reckoning is here, and it is not for you." The shadows closed in,